All who want to follow me must say no to themselves, pick up their cross, and follow me. On the first day of wrestling practice my senior year, we had a pretty good year our junior year, and football didn't need as much of the money as they were given, so we inherited a little bit extra funds. We had more people coming out for wrestling that year than ever before. So for the first day of practice, we met at the football field, not at the wrestling room, which was odd, but not out of character completely. Often we started by running bleachers before practice. And that's certainly what we did that year. We met on one end of the bleachers, and we would run snakes through the bleachers. Up, over, down, over, up, over. You feel me, right? On the football stadium steps. And then when you got to the other end, you just looped around. Loop back around. That's one. I'm so glad this makes sense to somebody. So we ran one. We waited for everybody to get back. Toot. We ran two. We waited for everyone to get back. Toot. Three. Somewhere around 15, 20, I'm not sure. One of the underclassmen decided to ask, "Coach, how many of these are we going to run?" No! That's a terrible question. Everybody knows that's a terrible question. It just doubled. Coach Carroll said, wait till the end of this story. Coach Carroll said, "Well, we have 20 lockers. There's 25 of you." Toot! And we took off running. And so slowly it makes its way through the group. We're going to run until 5 people quit. As soon as we made it way through the rest of the group, one of the guys going out for their heavyweight wrestler that year just walked off. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't say he changed his mind. He just went, "Oh, nope," and took off. And who could blame him? Anyway, by the time we hit the first hour mark, only 3 people had quit so far. Still 2 left. None of us were speaking. Nobody was talking to each other. All of us had gotten sick at some point already. And an hour and a half in, the 4th person quit. And that's when it got tough. Because from this point out, everyone does the same amount of work. Everybody runs the same distance. Nobody wants to be the last person to quit because you've worked just as hard as everybody else who made the team. And so the underclassmen begin to complain some more, and rightfully so. What an awful way to determine who makes the team. Unnecessarily brutish, of course. And Coach Carroll, I think, reveled in these complaints. He just stood there leaning on the rail of the bleachers, smoking a cigarette, blowing the smoke through his whistle as we ran another. This is also when the silence began to break. Jeremy Watson was one of my best friends. He got second in the state tournament the year before. And so he would be the one at the head of the line each time. And so after a while, about an hour and a half in, we'd all line up there at the start on the ramp to the bleachers. And Jeremy would turn around and say, "Trust the process. Follow me." Toot! And Jeremy would take off running. And we ran and we ran. And we heard him say, "Trust the process. Follow me." Toot! If you told me he said it 100 times over that next hour, I would have believed it. Trust the process. The only words that any of us spoke from the time the 4th person quit until the 5th person did. We learned which rails not to hold on to because they were slick, which steps to jump over because they were slick. And I broke down on one of my own rules this week. We ran bleachers for 2.5 hours that day before the last person quit, and we had the team right. I broke one of my own rules, and I called Jeremy Watson to make sure that I wasn't exaggerating the story before I told it. Most of the time I call after I've told it. Coach Carroll was never one to over-explain anything. But in time, all of us that year learned to trust the process. He didn't do anything aimlessly. He didn't do it just to make us miserable, despite all the evidence to the contrary. He did it to make us better. And it worked. The process worked. We had the best year Borger Wrestling had ever had and has had since. 8 of us placed in state, and we got 3rd as a team overall. For a tiny little town in the Texas Panhandle, all Texas schools compete against each other. We were pretty proud of that. The process produced the best wrestling results in Borger Bulldog history, which didn't take much. And that's the best metaphor I've got for this kind of discipleship that Jesus is talking about this morning. I don't tend to use sports metaphors. I just don't think winning and losing is the best metaphor for my faith most of the time. But Jesus calls us to follow Him. And He's headed to the cross. It's not an easy journey. Unless we forget where we are headed, He tells us to carry your own cross as we go. All who want to follow me must say no to themselves. Pick up your cross and follow me. The path Jesus calls us to is not an easy one. The cost is great, but the reward is greater. Salvation. And I don't mean pie in the sky, escape to the life to come. No, I mean salvation in this life. If salvation isn't about this life and this world first and foremost, then it's no salvation at all. It's about wholeness and healing right here, right now. But the path can be difficult. We might lose our lives. Or worse, Jesus says, we might not. Another reason I like that story, besides the fact it lets me relive the glory days, it's a good metaphor for how I feel in the world a lot of the time. Always running here, busy, dropping a kid off at school, going to visit the hospitals, meeting at CBFO, heading back to the church to do some more work. Hadley's got a runny nose, can't have that. Got to go pick up Hadley now, rinse and repeat over and over. And am I getting anywhere? Sometimes I feel like I'm still running bleachers, exhausted, pushing past reasonable limits, and for what? You ever felt like that? Spiritually, I don't think it's all that different either. I still struggle with the same things I've struggled with for years. I get impatient in the same all too predictable situations. I still buy things that I don't need when I get bored. I still get my feelings hurt by the very same trivial things that have hurt my feelings for decades. All of this work, trying to better myself, only to arrive back at the same place that I've started. Tired, but with not a whole lot to show for it sometimes. I need someone to say to me, trust the process. Follow me. Toot. These 2 stories in our text today, the call to discipleship and the Transfiguration, are connected. They're sandwiched there together on purpose. The call to follow Jesus down the path, the Jesus process, that leads directly to the mountain of transfiguration and to all of our transformation. Like Moses before him, Jesus takes 3 of his friends up on the mountain to meet with God. When Moses went up on Mount Sinai, he meets with God, and Moses' face radiates the glory of God for the rest of his life. The Bible tells us he has to wear a veil over his face because it scares people. The reflection of God's glory that never leaves him after that. And when we go up on the mountain with Jesus, we don't see him reflecting the glory of God. The way it's described is it emanates from his person, from him himself, not a reflection, but the source. Something of Jesus' heavenly nature is revealed there. It's beautiful and confusing. It's disorienting and awe-inspiring. The disciples are left not real sure what to do with it. They don't know what to say. And I understand that feeling each year on Transfiguration Sunday. And then nearly as soon as it began, it's over. And Jesus heads back down the mountain. But Peter doesn't want to. He wants to build tents and stay on the mountain, and who can blame him for that? It's what we all want to do. There are a great many things all trying to sell us the mountaintop experience, as Andre so aptly pointed out in his prayer. Products, experiences, religions, all saying that if you buy this or vote like that or attend this church, then you will have the mountaintop experience. But we can't stay on the mountaintop. Jesus is headed back down into the valley. And if we stay on the mountain, then we stay alone. And the next time Jesus will climb atop a mountain, it won't be for the Transfiguration. It will be for his crucifixion. It'll be a mountain called Golgotha. And no sooner does Jesus and his disciples leave the mountain, get back down into the valley, when they are confronted by a father and his sick child. And we learn that the disciples who are left behind have been unable to heal this child. They've been unable to help this father in his pain. And that's really important in this story. The inability of the disciples to fix it, to stop the pain. All they can do is bear witness to it. Confronted in the valley by the very real and personal suffering of the world, made personal in this father and his son. Confronted by suffering that they cannot fix and cannot heal. And here in the valley, in the middle of human pain, is where Jesus really shines. We may have seen his glory on the mountain, but we see his nature in the valley. And here's the central idea today. Following Jesus takes us up the mountain sometimes. But most of the time it takes us down into the valley, into the places of real human need and sorrow, especially our own. The Christian mystics have called this the path of descent for about 1,000 years. It's the idea that we don't commune with God by climbing further up and further up toward him through moral perfection. That's impossible. And this is the Gospel 101. God comes to us, not in our moral perfection, but in our imperfection. We can't climb up the mountain to reach him, but we still try, right? And we teach others to do the same. This is what most churches are organized around. How do we become more moral, better people? And that's a great goal. But far too many of us, through firsthand experience, can testify that we were hooked by grace, pulled in only to discover judgment. The path of descent says that we experience grace, that we experience God not through climbing up, but by crawling down. We don't climb the mountain to commune with Christ. He descends into the valley to meet with us. He meets us not in our perfection, but precisely in our imperfections, not through our victories, but in our failures, our weaknesses, and our limitations. This is the message of grace. And we find God in those places in us that we don't want to look. In the places where grace is most needed. Cynthia Bourgault is as close to a modern mystic as anyone I'm familiar with. She writes this: "The path of descent is the path of transformation. Struggle, failure, relapse, death, and woundedness are our primary teachers, rather than ideas and doctrine." We spend a lot of time on ideas and doctrine in church, and I'm not apologizing for that. Ideas and doctrines are matters of life and death. I've sat with way too many LGBTQ students who aren't convinced that their lives are worth living because of ideas and doctrines that they've absorbed in churches. Ideas and doctrines matter, and it matters that we take them very seriously. But ideas and doctrines can only take us so far on the path of transformation. As Bourgault points out, it is struggle. It's failure, relapse, death, woundedness that are our primary teachers if we want to experience the grace of God in the lives we have right now. About 10 years ago, I asked my mentor and pastor at the time what I needed to do to become a good preacher. Get as close to suffering as you can, he said, without taking even a second to think about it. Your preaching books are fine. I literally had one in my hand when I asked him that question. But you need to put them down and go be with the people who are hurting the most. Sometime later, he took me with him to see a couple from our church that was in a nursing home there. They were upper 80s, lower 90s maybe. She had severe dementia. He weighed maybe 90 pounds. They didn't share a room anymore because her dementia had progressed so far that she had become aggressive and hostile the way people do in the final stages of dementia sometimes. So we went and we got the husband first, and then we shuffled down to her room together. As soon as we walked through the door, she cussed at us when we walked in, and he apologized. That's another thing that happens with dementia patients sometimes. She was never a cusser before she got sick, he said. And then after a pause, he said, and now she cusses at her pastor. And it wasn't a pleasant visit. The wife was irritable, the husband embarrassed. She couldn't talk except for the occasional cuss word. And the rest of it was unintelligible. But my pastor brought communion elements to share with them and asked if they wanted to take communion before we left, and he said they did. After getting it ready, he recited the words of institution, then he gave the man the bread to dip in a little Tupperware of juice that he brought, intinction, like Jesus did. But instead of handing the wife a piece of bread, my pastor handed the bread to the husband. She had already been too aggressive with us while we were there. And the husband dipped it in the juice himself and then went to give it to her. Both of them had been deacons at Second Baptist Lubbock, which is where we were at the time. And she opened her mouth. He said, "The body of Christ broken for you." And then went to give it to her, and she said, "The blood of Christ spilled for you." It's clear as day. And then she took communion and smiled. And then we all cried. And this was a life lesson that he was teaching me that day, not just a preaching lesson that he was trying to share. See, one of the fundamental truths of the gospel is that we do not reach God at all, ever, through good moral or perfect behavior. It is through grace that God reaches us. And the gateway to grace is our mistakes, our failures. It's when we come to the limitations of our knowledge, when we come to the edges of what we are capable of, and that's when God comes to us. Rather than running from those things in shame, if we can learn to embrace them with grace and mercy, the way that God embraces them in us with grace and mercy, then it will transform us. That's the path of descent. But there's nothing easy about learning to see ourselves honestly. There's nothing easy about learning to sit with hurting and pain when we cannot fix it. It can be excruciating. And that's when we need to do it the most. And look at each other Be able to say, trust the process. It hurts. And it may hurt for a while longer, but it's not aimless and it's not in vain. Come on, follow me. Amen.